This is a test of the emergency broadcast system.
In 5, check for sound. 4,
It's showtime.
3,
Let's
2,
go.
1.
You're listening to the Pro Audio Suite, a program for audio and voiceover professionals. Welcome to another Pro Audio Suite. We have, of course, George Whittam in Los Angeles.
Hello, everybody. Sorry I've been missing for a while.
That's all right. We have a family business to get on with, and that's a good thing. Robbo.
G'day.
G'day, mate. Robert in Chicago is not here this week because he's having some family time with his daughter, which is a lovely thing.
That's right.
But we do have a guest for the show this week, and we're going to be talking about DAWs. And one of the premium DAW builders in the world, I might add, is Vin Curigliano. And he's got a company called Avum Technology, which is based in Melbourne, Australia, but works globally. G'day and happy birthday, Vin.
Yes, it is my birthday today. Yeah, happy 21st there. Yeah, it is my 21st.
Yeah.
21st anniversary of 30th?
21st anniversary of my 30th. Oh, actually, 34th. There you go.
Yeah. You're giving it away now.
I have.
But anyway, 55's the new black. Don't worry about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, give us a bit of background, because I've known you for obviously quite a few years now, and I use one of your machines. But how did you get into building DAWs?
I kind of fell into it, actually. I'm a keyboard player by musical trade. And being involved with the whole MIDI explosion and evolution through the 80s led me to these little computers called Ataris back in the day. So late 80s was the Atari. The Atari had a built-in MIDI interface, and the precursors of a lot of the software that's available now as the DAWs were purely MIDI sequences. So things like Steinberg Cubase was my primary software back in the day. And the MIDI was that tight on that little Atari because it was an integral part of the firmware and the hardware of the machine and the operating system. That replaced, the old physical sequences like MC500s or whatever else was popular during the day. So that was my first introduction into computing and music together. And as that evolved, we got to about the middle 90s and things were starting to move progressively towards being able to record stereo tracks of audio and what have you, and I had to get off the Atari.
So when was this, Vin? What year? Do you remember?
I remember the year. It was 1995, and Windows 95 had just come out, and I had a certain amount of money to spend. It was either a Windows machine or the Mac, and they were about $7,000, and the Windows machine was about $3,500. Saved myself some dollars and to see if I can get this Windows machine to work. And that started the journey, obviously, because, everyone was on Mac. Everyone had their arms crossed saying to me, well, what are you doing on Windows? You can't get that to work as an audio production machine. And here I am 23 years later.
So who else in the world was doing what you were doing at that time?
Back then, there might have been, there was a whole flurry of people that jumped in and then disappeared very quickly. But for those of us that have held on for all of these years, there's, actually one of them just closed recently, which I'm not going to name because he still hasn't publicly announced it, but he's been running for as long as what I have, and he's gone. I would say there's less than 5 that I would consider really good at what they do, and that's worldwide.
Wow. So what about all the people that were using Macs? I mean, just about every studio you walked into had a G4 or whatever it was back then. Traditionally,
people that are more Mac-focused would always have the perception that Windows machines were just a minefield because of the huge variations of hardware configurations, and it's not really the case. Especially with you've got an Intel and an AMD. It's like the Cola Wars. You've got 2 competing main chip manufacturers. So at any given time of product development, you've got a couple of chipsets and a couple of CPUs. Now I choose to stick with Intel for various reasons. I don't dabble with the AMD side of things, and even when they did have the so-called performance lead back in the early 2000s, they didn't deliver a package in the sense that, yes, the CPUs might have been a little bit faster, but the chipsets weren't as compatible. So there was far greater compatibility and consistency with the Intel platform. So that's what I've stuck with. And so like any given time, there might be, 2 chipsets that you're dealing with in a CPU architecture. And, you could choose a couple of different motherboards, do your R&D, sign off on it, then stick to that configuration, and you'd have something as consistent as anything that Apple could provide. But you could, you can hand select each component, and you can build in your reliability and your consistency. And they've proved very, very reliable. And so this is why I'm still around 17 years after going out on my own.
I thought Mac changed their chips at some point, and I can't remember what happened. When
Apple went to Intel, I think it was around 2006, and that was quite a dramatic shift because all of a sudden the veil dropped. Apple was always trying to portray themselves as something completely different from the Intel ecospace, and then all of a sudden they're using it, so they had to backpedal a lot, and it leveled the playing field a lot because all of a sudden we're really dealing with very close to identical base systems. The only difference was the operating system, and that's what came about there was that as soon as people went to Intel, they realised, well, maybe we can get OS X running on normal PCs, and that kind of opened up a few doors to, people like to call them Hackintoshes. The Hackintosh, yeah. And when I started getting into that, there was still the typical Mac versus PC arguments flying all over the place, especially on places like Gear Sluts, and Mac people would have no problem paying a premium for their Mac systems because they were beautifully made, well engineered. Everything was at a level where you knew exactly what you got, where the PC could be just cobbled together with the lowest common denominator components. And of course, that's not going to be the same. So once you started comparing apples to apples instead of apples to pears, so to speak, it became, the playing field was very, very level as far as hardware performance.
It's so funny because 2006 is when I jumped to Mac.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when I actually made that transition.
So what was your experience on the Windows machines prior to that?
Well, I built many of them myself, and I had varying degrees of success. But the reason that I made the transition was because I moved to LA. I was doing computer support for voiceover actors, and the vast majority of them were on Mac. And I was totally just uninformed, and I knew I had to get a Mac. So I had a Mac and a Windows laptop running together for a long time until I just decided I was becoming more and more comfortable in the Mac OS environment, and I just really transitioned my world over. But my needs are different because I'm not an engineer and I don't produce, so I don't need massive high track count and extreme low latency and gobs of RAM. For what I do, I just need something that I can understand and operate easily and manage. And then the vast majority of my clients, again, are on the Mac, so I knew I had to be very Mac-centric.
And look, and it does come down to familiarity. And you won't hear me even though I get into these Mac versus PC debates, and people will always try and drag me in. And instead of getting into this typical narrative of one versus the other, what I decided to do, and which was kind of pretty taboo when I did it, but I've got a blog site that's called DAW Bench, DAW Bench, dawbench.com. And so this was around that 2004, 2005 era. Now, apart from the whole Mac versus PC thing, I was embroiled in the middle of an Intel versus AMD thing. And if you think Mac versus PC fanboys are rabid, the AMD guys are on an absolute another level, And so what was happening back around that 2004, 2005, and you probably remember this, George, if you've been a PC guy, AMD were the secondary chip. They'd come up with something that was a little bit better in performance than the Intel, but their chipsets, again, was that whole compatibility problem thing. But what they did is they started seeding some of the systems to some high-profile engineers in the US for free. Then these guys would go onto the forums, whether it was a Steinberg forum or Gearsluts and everyone else, and they were basically shills. And they'd get on there and they would just sit there and start pushing these AMD systems and the better performance, and they were basing them on these audio benchmarks based within a DAW, but they were reading the performance meter, and I'm sitting there looking at that going, well, literally that's about as useless as tits on a bull because it doesn't show us anything, and it's not actually a performance metric at all, because what would happen is that you'd say, okay, here's this test session that you can run, and it's got 40 tracks of audio and 120 plugins or whatever else.
Right.
And they'd read the ASIO performance meter. Now, the ASIO performance meter is a combination of the driver performance within the specific to the card and the resources that are available. Let's say, for example, one was reading 50%, the other one was reading 35%. So they'd say, hey, that's 15% better. But it's not. It's again, they weren't kind of figuring out that the metric was not really representative of anything, and you couldn't really scale it correctly. So what I did, I created some benchmarks, and they pretty much became the pseudo industry standard, where I have a session. I build a session up in Cubase. I've built them up in all different DAWs now, and I would apply an incremental and progressive load just by flicking plugins on in real time. You would get an exact breakpoint of where the session collapsed instead of just reading the meter. And what we found was that where these sessions were, say reading 50% CPU load, that was all well and good. But what it wasn't showing you was that the AMD machines were absolutely collapsing at about a 65-70% load, where the Intels would actually scale all the way up to 95 to close to 100%. And it's got to the point now where the software can't keep up with the hardware, where before the hardware, it was the opposite. And that's one of the major shifts that's happened probably over the last 4 or 5 years. The software now we're up to 18 physical cores on the Intel machines. AMD have just announced something like a 32-core, 64 logical core processor this week, which I'm kind of chuckling about because no software application can thread more than 32 threads. So it's kind of pointless, but it's pretty impressive,
Do you have anyone with PCs at all, George?
Yeah, absolutely. They tend to be a little bit more, for lack of a better word, self-reliant. Either that or they're just totally new to the business completely, and they're just using what they know. And so they have a laptop, a Windows laptop or whatever, and they're using what they've got. But the overwhelming majority is on Mac, but I do have to stay up to speed with Windows stuff because I have a lot of clients who are using Audition 3.0, Audition 1.5, which is basically Cool Edit, SoundForge. They're using DAWs and editors that are Windows-based systems. So I run Windows on a VMware on my Mac Mini and my MacBook Air, and I can run, those systems without a hiccup, no problem at all, from my Macs and be in lockstep with what they're doing. So if they're on SoundForge 9, I'll be running SoundForge 9 on Windows, or if they're on Audition 3, then I'm on Audition 3 on Windows. So it's not really been an issue, and it's amazing what computers with enough RAM and an SSD can do. And like my 2011 Mac Mini, I've done webinars where I'm showing people the different DAWs that are available, or DAWs, and I'll have 5 or 6 of them open all simultaneously, and I'll just do full screen swaps, or I'll swipe with 4 fingers across my trackpad, and now you're looking at Audition, now you're looking at Pro Tools, now you're looking at Twisted Wave, now you're looking at Audacity, and I can have them all running simultaneously, and the computer has no problem. So it's really incredible what the capabilities are now of a modern PC, or Mac in this case.
Boot Camp was a bit of a game changer for Mac, though, wasn't it? I mean, there was a lot of users who didn't use Mac because they were afraid of the interface. And then all of a sudden, when you could load Windows onto a Mac frame, that sort of changed the game a little bit, didn't it?
I guess for gamers, and maybe for really high-level musicians that have to run, have to have every last ounce of the computer's power available to them, that really came into play. But again, for my world, where I'm not a super power user of the machine unless I'm editing video, the VMware way of doing things, for me, the convenience trumps the power any day. Being able to just launch VMware and resume a suspended Windows 7 session and go back to work is great. And I'm not moving beyond Windows 7 for the foreseeable future.
Yes.
Boot Camp was actually a response from Apple to the OS X86. It was very quickly realized that we could run OS X on straight machines, and especially those that were using identical chipsets that the Mac Pros were based on at the time. And that's what my, we'll call it OS X86 machine that I did all of the comparative benchmarking on was based on. And when that happened, Apple just turned around and went, okay, hang on, the horse has bolted. And they very, very quickly released Boot Camp, which was a smart move on their part because, but at the same time they also locked down OS X via their UEFI, so that you couldn't just install it directly onto an open BIOS on like a normal PC, and it took a tiny little script, and this is what all a Hackintosh is essentially. There's a tiny little script in the boot sector that tricks it into thinking that the system has a Mac official UEFI, and once it gets past that little boot sector, bang, it goes in. And if the machines are close to identical to the official Mac hardware, they run superbly, and that's what a lot of people have found, and they continue using them. I've got to be very careful because I can't sit there and promote it because I don't do the systems. I only did it personally just to do some comparative testing. And the interesting thing for me was that when I actually did that, and I did start running some cross-platform performance testing with the various DAWs, the first thing that I needed to do was confirm that my OS X implementation on the OS X 86 machine was actually performing up to par. Similar or up to par to an official Mac Pro. And so I ran all these comparative benchmarks, and there was this huge variance. And when I say there was a huge variance, it was massive, especially at the lower latencies. So the first thing I needed to do was to confirm that my OS X 86 machine was not hosed, the performance wasn't hosed. So I sent all of the results to a colleague of mine, a close friend in Norway, in Europe, who was quite knowledgeable in cross-platform performance, and we were both very prominent in the Steinberg community at the time. So I sent him the results without giving him my results. I've said, can you run these specific benchmarks on your machine? Now, my machine was the first of the i7s. It's just a quad-core, 2.6 gigahertz, and his Mac Pro was not a single, it was actually a dual quad-core. So we had a dual quad-core Mac Pro. The clock speed was a little bit down, I think 2.23 or 2.33, but he had essentially double the number of cores, so double the number of threads, and he ran the results, sent me back the results, and I was expecting them to be proportionally far better than mine. Instead, what we found was that a hacked standard Windows machine running OS X, giving almost double the performance, especially at the low latencies. And what we discovered was that there was some clocking issues with the official hardware where it wasn't actually sustaining a steady clock speed, and it was ramping up and down. This is due to what they call EIST, or speed stepping. And there was some weird bug in the UEFI platform where it was not maintaining a steady clock speed. So you couldn't see this on normal Mac peripherals. Everything was looking absolutely hunky-dory. What we needed to do, we needed to go deeper down into some troubleshooting applications, and we were finding that the clock speed was ramping up and down like a saw wave, and that was impacting the performance to an enormous degree. Now, the Mac community were totally oblivious to it because they just crossed their arms going, we don't know what the hell you're talking about, because they didn't have a direct comparative against, an open BIOS platform machine. So if you go read my reports on DAWbench, I had to do about 6 of them because as soon as this became public, the pushback was enormous. No one wanted to accept that Apple was actually, essentially hobbling their official hardware.
To what end? Why would they do that? What's the motivation?
There was no motivation there, George. I don't even think they realised. I mean, this was something that we hit the ball out of the park. I mean, when I first saw those results, it sat me flat on my ass. I'm like, here I was thinking that my OS X implementation was actually screwed. When the results came back that I had, the Mac Pro with twice the processing power even performing worse, then that was, our minds were blown. We're thinking, okay, we've got to dig a little bit deeper. We had to get into Unix kernel type level stuff to figure out what the hell was going on with the clock speeds. And interestingly, it wasn't a thermal thing. It was just it could not sustain a steady clock. So it was ramping up and down between whatever the base speed step was, which clocks the CPUs down if you're on battery or whatever else, right? Or if, under low usage. Mm-hmm. And then the top clock speed. So it was going up and down, up and down. And I mean, without any application to be able to measure that, the only way that we were actually perceiving it was in the performance variable that we were measuring. I did it on Pro Tools, I did it on Studio One, I did it on Reaper. So anything was pretty much cross-platform that I could get my hands on, I did the comparative performance on, and in every instance, the Windows machine was still outperforming the OS X machine. So, so all of a sudden, we're kind of accomplishing this stuff in native on Windows, and that got the attention of a lot of people. Now, with the Mac thing, that it did get fixed. It did get fixed.
That was my next question. Did it get fixed?
Yes, it did. It did get fixed. It was really late in the Mac Pro life cycle, and it was remember the last of the Mac Pro the cheese graters, the single hexacores not the jewels, but the single hexacore. If people would be almost selling a kidney to get a hold of those, they are glorious machines. And yes, they did fix it. So if you read through my reports, I did 10.5, 10.6, and it was XP, and then it was Windows 7. So it was just that whole transition around that 2008, 2009. And the other thing that we discovered with the whole Windows versus OS X comparative performance was that where the Windows machines run on ASIO, which is a Steinberg protocol, extremely...
ASIO.
Yep, ASIO, yep. Extremely efficient, low latency protocol. Still to this day, no one is really using the native Windows low latency stuff because ASIO hasn't been surpassed. And Core Audio was the standard Apple OS X low latency driver, which is very, very good, but it can't match ASIO. And so again, we have to get into the investigation and try and dig out why is the Windows machine so much better at low latency? Because, I mean, Windows is not a real-time operating system in any way, shape, or form. So it was almost a happy accident, And
so the people that are doing lots of virtual instruments, the really hardcore ones, probably favoring Windows systems?
Yeah, have been for many years, George, have been. So this is probably an area that you don't see a lot of, but a lot of the orchestral composers. I mean, look, there's some of them still on Mac, obviously. They're using Logic, but they'll also have an array of slave machines.
Digital Performer.
But they'll have a array of slave machines doing a whole stack of their orchestral stuff as well.
Yeah, I did install some acoustics in a musician's studio, which is very rare for me. Mostly it's voiceover, and that gentleman, this is, 5-6 years ago. Mm-hmm. He may have had a PC called a Carillon or something like that.
Carillon, yes, Carillon.
And he swore by that. He was a jingle composer, film composer, used a lot of virtual instruments, multi-instrumentalist, obviously very talented.
Yep.
He did a lot of drum programming, and that was his machine. He said, this blows anything from the Apple world away. And now I can see why.
Yeah. Well, look, Carillon they were the first professional PC DAW company that had the resources they created their own case, and then they had all of these very ultra-quiet components, but that was really the first branded specialist PC DAW. And like I said, they manufactured their own specialist cases and stuff, and they came and went. With what happened with Carillon is that they had that proprietary case, which was awesome, but they built thousands of them, but they built them at a time that was, the thermal integrity of that case was for the architecture of that time. So those cases became ovens, and because they had that proprietary case, that's the only case they could use, they were kind of caught. And then what they did was they franchised the brand out. Then the franchisees were actually building these systems, and I would just hazard to guess that the quality control was not where it should have been, and it just dropped off, and eventually it just kind of disappeared. And yes, the Carolines were pretty much the guys that put the specialist PC DAW on the map. So I will give them credit for that.
Interesting. But now we should talk about the hot topic, which is what Windows are doing with Windows 10.
Windows was always something that was far more manageable and customizable. And so that was the positive for us. And we could deploy them exactly as we needed. We could lock them down and send them out, and the systems just worked. Things started shifting. You had XP, then when Vista came out, that was an absolute disaster. I don't know if anyone can remember Vista, but that was good old Vista. That was an absolute disaster. And at the same time, where 10.5 was getting very, very bloated as well, OS X 10.5. We were going Tiger, Leopard, and I was making jokes saying, what's the next one? Garfield, because it was just getting so fat. It was getting so fat and bloated. But at exactly the same time, the Microsoft realised, look, we've got to start getting back to the basics of, and we're going to streamline this kernel and we're going to improve the performance of it. And granted, Apple did exactly the same with OS X 10.6, and that's Snow Leopard. I think it's Snow Leopard. Windows 7 and OS X 10.6, to me, are probably the best versions of each operating system for DAWs that pretty much have ever existed. And so we had the disaster of Windows 8. That just didn't work. It was an absolute disaster. So I've kind of been a little bit at odds with Microsoft since the Windows 8 implementation. But, they realised very, very quickly that you can't polish a turd, I mean, it doesn't matter how much you polish it, it might be shiny, but it's still a turd. So they went, okay, we need to go back to the drawing board again. And so Windows 10 was supposed to be a return. And all of us in the professional Windows community just thought it's got to go back to something more akin to Windows 7. And that's what the premise originally was. It was supposed to be, okay, we've listened to you, you don't like the GUI and you don't like the tiles, and we're going to go back to more of a Windows 7. And in the meantime, we've got a change of CEO at Microsoft between Steve Ballmer and the new fellow, Nadella. He's almost kind of like a wannabe Steve Jobs. He's very charismatic, but he's not interested in Windows as a performance platform. He's more into the cloud. I call it the cloud circus, because that's pretty much what it's become. It's become everything is so focused on delivering everything as a service to the cloud. So
anymore that Apple is interested in making macOS a performance platform. Neither of them. No. I mean, we can get to the OS X side of it as well. But I mean, with the Windows side of stuff, we always had a very solid, streamlined, performance-orientated platform that we could build our solutions on. OS X, unfortunately, it's more like a walled garden, because this is what you get, and if you don't like it, too bad. Where Windows, especially because of the enterprise-level integration, they really couldn't do that. I mean, they could do it at the home and whatever else. But once we started talking about the Pro, so there's no OS X Home, OS X Pro, OS X Enterprise. I mean, there was an OS X Server back in the day, but that didn't really last that long. So you've got one version of OS X, one size fits all, that's it. With Windows, it was different. So we didn't really care. When I say we, the greater community of IT professionals and integrators, we didn't really care what they did at home. They could do whatever they want. They could sit there and metadata mine these people. I call it the sheeple majority. I couldn't care less what they did there, because it didn't really affect us. What happened at 10, though, is that the original premise of going back to the Windows 7 model got thrown out the water, basically being an asset to deliver cloud services. So everything is a web terminal.
Yeah.
It's just a terminal to access the web.
Correct. So Windows 10 didn't really do anything except up the ante. So instead of reversing what they did with Windows 8, they actually upped the ante with that whole Windows Store and the whole apps. But then there's all these dependencies in the background with these small little applications as well. And, again, this is a kind of touchy subject of the level of telemetry that's always been constantly getting fed back, but it is constantly talking. But the biggest problem with Windows 10 is that they've enforced these automatic upgrades. Now, again, for the home user, sheeple majority, I couldn't care less. But when we are trying to implement a Windows 10 solution, we can't have it automatically just sit there dialing in and doing security updates or driver updates. We can't allow it to do that, especially on the mission critical machines, because it does shift the dots and it does and will break things. So we have to try and manage how to get these automatic updates under control.
So how did you do it?
I did about 18 months of R&D before I actually deployed my first Windows 10 machine, and that is the longest R&D I've done on any operating system. I mean, Windows 7, my R&D was a week, and it was hit the ground running. Windows 10, 8, 10, almost a year in the beta stage, and I just kept breaking this thing, doing the most basic things. And I'm like, how the hell am I going to deploy this thing if I just touch, some minor adjustment and I'm breaking things like start menus and everything else? But I couldn't move forward because I'm going, well, it might be an annoyance, but it'll break a mission-critical system in a heartbeat if we can't get to the start menu. So I kept putting off the Windows 10 deployment. One thing that they removed in the earlier version of Windows, and George, you'd probably remember this as well back in the day, is that in the update menu, you had an option to say never check for updates. You took responsibility.
It's a very important checkbox.
It is. Now, you took responsibility, and I mean, we are adults. We're not idiots. We're taking responsibility and accountability for our own deployments. So you never check for updates, and you would check for the updates if and when. If it ain't broken, don't fix, And also prior to Windows 10, any of those updates, you had a checkbox. So you can defer them. But sooner or later, that thing's going to flood onto your system. So the first argument was, well, how dare you say that you're going to update our hardware drivers? We've just configured this mission-critical machine. You're going to sit there and start changing graphics drivers, chipset drivers, or whatever else, network drivers. No, the system is locked down. It's working. I don't want you to touch them. But the automatic update regimen was something that I had to stop because I just couldn't deploy with it going. And there's a lower-level administrative area called Group Policy Editor. Now, in the Group Policy Editor, back in the earlier versions of Windows, and I'm actually giving you some IP that I haven't shared with anyone. In the auto update menu, there were some options numbered 1 to 5. The crucial one was 1, never check for updates. Now, mysteriously, in Windows 10, that disappeared, right? So they didn't want you to say never check for updates. What we discovered, when I say we, myself and a few other people stumbled on it, is that if you actually disabled the setting completely, took a screenshot, sent it to my Microsoft liaison, he thought I'd photoshopped it at first. He said, how the hell did you do that? I'm going, well, I'm not going to tell you, because if I tell you and they break it, I'm going to blame you. So look, with all due respect to my mate there, I won't go naming him because it's not fair, but
You'll break it.
They did break it. Right. He had nothing to do with it because it became a little bit more public knowledge. But that's when my battle with Microsoft really kind of upped the ante a bit with Windows 10, because all of a sudden they purposely targeted that setting in the Group Policy Editor, which, I mean, you got to think. Let's think about it, George, and Robbo and Andrew. What is the percentage of the global Windows user base that would be affecting? I mean, the only people that really knew about it were people like myself, and some IT managers, people that are kind of managing, larger IT deployments that have to control the updates in these mission-critical systems. I mean, what's the percentage? It wouldn't even be a 1%. But they purposely targeted us, and I say us as a collective, and took that away. So they broke that, and so we couldn't get this, never check for updates. So once we went to that new version where they took the group policy, at every revision after that, they're taking even more and more settings away from the control from the group policy. And I just don't understand it. I mean, it is purposely targeting a very small sector of people that are just trying to manage their own machines. They even do things like Cortana. Now, I'm not sure if you know what Cortana. It's kind of similar. It's like Siri, which is the integrated search for Windows 10. One of the choices that you had, and it was selectable. It wasn't no hacking required. In the earlier versions of Windows 10, you would say, "Would you like your internal search string to be shared from the internet?" Anyone, could find their ass in a well-lit room, would go, right-click, bang, no, I don't want the search to be shared on the web. They took that facility away because everyone was disabling it and they weren't getting the metadata that they were probably requiring for whatever reason.
I know over the years on the Mac side, there's always been little third-party apps that could get under the hood a little bit. One of them was called Onyx.
Yep.
And it wasn't doing anything too hacky, I guess, but I guess it was doing things that if you know how to use command line, you could change. Mm-hmm. But it was a GUI, a user interface for changing things that normally you can only do in the command line.
Yeah, and that's what they...
Isn't there equivalents for Windows?
Yes, of course. And I've been using them for years. And on Windows 10, one of the premises of Windows 10 was that you don't need to tweak this anymore. Tweaks are going to probably be detrimental. Well, there's not a consensus across the Windows DAW users as well. If you go to Gearsluts, the whole Windows 10 experience thread, it turned into a clusterfuck. Seriously, and I apologise for swearing, but that's pretty much the only way for me to describe it, because you've got people would post their experience, and if anything was construed as negative, we had a couple of guys on there that was all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe they had shares in Microsoft. I don't understand what their motivation was, but they'd just jump on anyone that would post anything that was even vaguely construed as negative. And, they'd cross their arms and go, work and find working as design. That's their whole mantra. But it wasn't, because those guys would be sitting there navigating their own little minefields when certain things were breaking with upgrades. But, of course, that gets pushed under the carpet and they just keep sitting there and pounding on people that would dare say anything negative.
I know people like that on the Mac side who are like, I always install the updates. I always install the upgrades. They always work.
I always install
Why would you not do that? I'm like, really?
Yes.
Look, one thing that I've learnt on the forum is, we'll call it netiquette, and where I'm not overly abusive, but I'm very assertive. And, I've got myself in trouble over the years where I actually got banned for, what was the term? I was diagonally abusing people. I was never directly, I was diagonally abusing people. Which seriously, we're going, what the fuck? He's diagonally abusing someone. And so it was basically being assertive and using sarcasm. Now, there's various people in Europe that they don't get the sarcasm, especially German, Austrian. These guys, they don't know what the fuck Aussie sarcasm is. So they just saw me as being, I don't know, abusive, kind of, but not directly. So I got banned for, diagonally abusing someone.
There's probably an app that will speak in diagonalies very soon. But talking of apps, do you actually use any? Yes,
I do use them. And for all of the guys that are defending that, there's not much going on in the background. I mean, one of the applets that I use has a privacy pane. There's a tab, privacy pane, and there's probably 15 levels of telemetry that you have to disable, whether it's advertising IDs and all of this other stuff that it's reporting back. So 15 levels of telemetry just in the one tab, and there's 10, 15 tabs in this applet to go through and basically silence these. There's also another applet that's simply called Shut Up 10. So I run these two applets, Shut Up 10, and there's another one that's called Ultimate Windows Tweaker. Now, I don't mind sharing that now because it's basically the ship has almost sailed for me. I've got 1 foot out the door almost, I've said to a lot of my colleagues, I've gone, I want to exit the zoo because I've got to the point now where it feels like I'm playing whack-a-mole with Microsoft at every update revision. And I'm getting tired of it. And so I deploy systems at the moment which are earlier revisions of Windows 10. They are completely locked down. They're bordering on end of life as far as I call them insecurity updates. And so I've got to read my clients the Riot Act and saying these systems, you have to treat them as embedded systems, as simply as that. Because I can't guarantee that if we do run an update, this thing is not going to hose your performance.
I was curious about the interface of choice for external peripherals. So on Windows or on Mac side, of course, the state-of-the-art is Thunderbolt 3.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the way people on the PC Windows side are going to achieve low latencies? Or is that considered, is it just too new? Is it not necessary?
No.
What people are using?
Well, I mean, Thunderbolt is essentially PCIe. It's all it is. It's external PCIe by 4.
External PCIe with some other junk baked into it.
Well, it's not junk. It's an external PCIe protocol interconnect. It's an interconnect that's directly into the PCIe by 4 bus. That's all it is. It's also linking directly into PCIe 16 for the DisplayPort graphics side of stuff. But for the audio application, it's essentially PCIe. That's what it is. And one of the other things that I've done with DAW Bench is shared a lot of my internal IP on low latency performance as far as audio interfaces. So I've got this huge database that I've collected over the last 7 or 8 years, and I share it publicly, and there's this huge ongoing thread of Gearslutz that's now, so it's actually pinned. And there's thousands of posts on there, and like what I did with the Mac versus PC comparative performance thing, I've gone and stuck my foot in it by saying, well, what's going on with these audio interfaces in regards to what is the actual reported latency, what is the actual delivered latency, and what is the efficiency at those respective latencies. So again, using those benchmarks that I developed, I created a procedure where I can comparatively compare each interface, and then I graph it all up, and I've done a rating type of system, and it's huge, and I've got most, if not all, audio interface manufacturers watching that thread very, very closely. I get the manufacturers sending me interfaces to test and report back. I had a good friend, Andrew Jerram, in Tasmania, who's a software developer, develop a little utility called an RTL utility, which stands for round trip latency utility, which allows anyone to very quickly test the exact round trip latency through the driver and through the A to D and D to A. You know, not all USB interfaces are created equal, not all Thunderbolt interfaces are created equal, not all PCIe are created equal. So just going Thunderbolt isn't going to guarantee you, the immediate better performance. And some of the companies there, I really don't want to name it, but there's some that, their Thunderbolt implementation was not very good at all, to the point where their line of Thunderbolt interfaces that they initially rolled out, they've now released a USB 2 version of it. and the USB 2 version actually performs better than their Thunderbolt version. Where there's other companies, and I don't mind naming the ones that are actually performing really well. PreSonus, the PreSonus Quantum, a phenomenal interface in regards to low latency performance. And they had a really tough time with their earlier USB 3 interface, and they acknowledged that they had a problem, and they came back and hit the ball out of the park with the Quantum. That's fantastic. Companies like RME, who do all their own internal R&D, do all their IP, do all of their driver development, their firmware development. So none of the RME interfaces actually have a controller. It's all done by the FPGA DSP. So they can write the protocol into the FPGA. And again, RME are a company that pretty much set the benchmark that everyone else has to try and reach. Yeah. And that's been the case. That's been the case for well over a decade.
Yeah, those guys. You may not always like their user interface, but boy, for sheer rock solid driver and everything, they're the ones to beat.
Yeah, and it's fantastic that they've actually maintained that. And you could have a 10-year-old. Actually, I've got a 15-year-old RME interface here, Firewire 1. They're still releasing drivers for it. It is a company that I highly respect, not only for the quality of the interfaces. And again, people are going to argue about A to D and D to A's. You're never going to get consensus on that, obviously.
Sure.
But like you said, George, the drivers and the consistency and just maintaining, updating the drivers for even the older legacy interfaces. I mean, that's, there's not many companies that do that. Yeah. Maybe Lynx is another one off the top of my head.
Really high end.
Sorry?
No, it just says a lot about the says a lot about the company when you can own a piece of gear 15 years old and get support and get a driver.
Yeah.
You know, that says a hell of a lot about the integrity of the company, who their client base is. You know, that says a lot.
Well, look, and just in defense of some of the smaller, not smaller, some of the other companies, they don't have the resources. I mean, the guys that write the drivers at RME, I mean, they're guns. You know, I can't remember the guys' names. There's two brothers that actually do it. Phenomenal. But you need the resources to be able to deliver that. And, you know, the situation that we have at the moment is that a lot of the manufacturers do not have the resources internally, so they will commission a third party to write the driver, or they'll just get some off-the-shelf stuff. And that is very much the case for, you know, fill in the blank here. You know, and all of these guys that have USB 2 interfaces that have near identical performance, very mediocre, and it's the same driver, you know. It's exactly the same driver, third-party driver. The performance has always been mid to mediocre, and they'll actually change the window dressing on the control panel. But once you start doing some, you know, round-trip latency measurements and you see near identical performance on the benchmarks, you know exactly what the driver is, and it's got a very, very similar fingerprint across the board, you know.
Are there any others up there on, you know, close to on par with RME in your mind?
Not across the board, no. Not across the board. I mean, Focusrite really upped their game on the USB 2 driver over the last couple of years. There was a lot of the manufacturers that were using Firewire in the past were using a chipset and driver combination from a company called TC Applied. So there was companies like Mackie, Focusrite, Presonus, even M Audio.
Echo?
No, Echo had their own. But so these guys that were using the TC Applied driver, and this is, if you read my reports, I'm going, what? Hang on, what's going on here? Why are these different brand manufacturers having exactly the same results across the board? And, you know, the light bulb went on and gone, hang on, they're using a third-party controller and driver. And so that's when my investigation started, and I discovered who it was, TC Applied. And I remember sending an email to TC Applied directly and saying, look, you know, the driver's okay, but I think there's some room for improvement. And the proof in the pudding is that M Audio have taken your driver and done a slight variation and amendment to it, and it's performing better. So I think you guys can improve it. And the first response was, we don't know what you're talking about. The driver's performing beautifully. And we're like, okay, all right. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, they released the version 4 driver that was almost on par to the RME Firewire. So, you know, there are people listening, but it's just, you know, trying to get them on board and listening to what we actually require. But then again, what's the percentage of people that actually require those preferred lower latencies? You know, I don't know. So I'm not a figures man. I don't know what the actual percentage is. All I know is that the reaction that I get from the reports that I do is that there is a large number of people that do prefer working at those lower latencies.
That's a big marketing. Focusrite's Claris interfaces.
Claris, yeah.
Thunderbolt is a big part of their marketing message.
Yep.
And it's low latency.
Yeah, and there's also a fellow that at the moment that I heard you mention him a couple of times in the previous podcast, and I've got to be careful, that has promised an audio interface that was going to rewrite the record. Rewrite the rule book pretty much, you know, the whole landscape on low latency performance, native performance. And he's very, very vocal against anything to do with the DSP. And but the product is, it's 18 months late, you know. I mean, we haven't seen it. We keep hearing
Vaporware.
Yeah, it is Vaporware. Well, it's not Vaporware. I mean, I think the release of it is getting very, very close. But, you know, he promised a lot. When I say he promised a lot. We haven't seen anything yet. And the amount of hype that at the initial launch kind of reminded me of remember that ShamWah? Remember that guy that used to sell those those chamois. ShamWow. Remember that guy?
ShamWow.
You remember the ShamWow guy?
Yeah.
Well, I think you might know who I'm talking about, but it's someone that it has a marketing style very, very similar to that ShamWow, and he's made a lot of promises, and I'm not seeing any of it just yet. So some of the low latency claims, and all of them happen just to be at 96, which is another little marketing ploy where they will say, our interface has, this amount of millisecond round-trip latency at 96K. Well, that's great. Don't go promoting it only at that 96K. Again, and you could probably vouch for this as well, a lot of the people that work at 96, what do they deliver at? Are they delivering at 96? I doubt it,
Rarely.
No, it'd be 24/48.
So the whole 96 marketing thing is always a little ploy because it basically halves your latency value, Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because we should say thank you very much, Vin, for joining us. If anybody's wondering about the noises in the background, that wind and sort of hashy noise, I should tell you that Vin does live in a very large haunted castle that's been occupied by aliens. But that's for another show.
Hey, you lived around here for many, many years, Andrew. You know what it's like. When the wind blows through good old Viewbank and Eltham, mate, you know exactly what's going on.
That's right. Watch out
for those the Widowmaker ghost gumps.
Exactly. All right.
And apologies if I actually did bore you guys to death, but and I could have kept going.
I know you well.
We might have to do round two.
We need to plug your company because I've had one of your computers for how long have I had that?
10 years or so, I think. We're probably bordering on that.
It must be
bordering on it.
It would have to be about 10.
So the company's Avum Technology. And www.avimt.com.au is the web address. And if you want to check out my blog site, it's just dawbench.com, dawbench.com. And you'll find the threads on the low latency performance database at Gearslutz, and it's actually pinned at the top. And it's a big read, but it's if you're interested in getting some good feedback on the actual delivered performance of audio interfaces, it's worth a read. And I've also Andrew has just finished developing that round trip latency utility for OS X as well, because a lot of people are asking for it. So we've done that, and again, that's going to become the mythbuster now, because a lot of the Mac fraternity just didn't really think twice about it. They just accepted the reported latencies, and no one ever bothered to actually check. Yes, now you can. There you go.
Goodbye. Wipe the tear, baby dear, from your eye. Though it's hard to part, I know I'll be tickled to death to go. Don't cry, don't sigh. There's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, old thing, cheerio, chin chin, na poo toodaloo, goodbye.